were born in Vietnam. Your first days were wrapped in heat, green fields, and the sound of insects in the evening. Mornings began with roosters calling out before the sun rose. Neighbors shared food. Adults laughed. Life felt simple. You were held close. You were safe. At least, it felt that way. As you grew, your memories weren't about toys or games. They were about sounds, a deep rumble far away, windows shaking just slightly, adults going quiet mid-conversation. Every time that sound came, hands grabbed you tighter, faces changed, smiles disappeared. You didn't understand why. You just learned that some sounds meant fear. You started noticing things that didn't make sense. Certain paths were never used. Some fields were completely avoided. Adults watched the sky more than they watched you. Sometimes you left home suddenly. No packing, no explanation, just movement. Urgency. One day you asked why you were always told to be quiet. The question didn't get an answer right away. The sky spoke first. Only after the sound passed, the adult said, "Because being seen is dangerous." No one explained further. They didn't need to. You never asked again. You weren't born into a quiet village. You were born into a battlefield. You were born during the Vietnam War. The sounds you thought were distant storms were bombs. The empty paths weren't forgotten. They were dangerous. The silence from adults wasn't secrecy. It was survival. The world finally made sense. And that scared you more than not knowing. There was no such thing as a normal day. School happened when it could. Some families left and never returned. You learned to read faces before words. You learned when to run by watching adults' eyes. You grew older, but not softer. You grew sharper, quieter. Even when the sky went quiet, the danger didn't stop. The ground remembered the war. One wrong step could change everything. One careless game could end a childhood. Fields that once fed families became places no one trusted. You stopped running. You stopped playing. You learned where to place your feet. By the time you were 12, people stopped calling you a child. You were tall enough, strong enough, quiet enough. You could carry things. You could follow orders. You could keep secrets. At 13, the war found you directly, not through stories, not through sounds, through responsibility. You were given tasks, messages to carry, supplies to move, sometimes a weapon you barely understood. Your hands shook at first, then they didn't. No one trained you to fight, they trained you to survive. One day, you realized something quietly. You weren't pretending anymore. You weren't helping. You weren't learning. You were part of the war. Not because you chose to be, but because there was no other place to stand. Childhood didn't end with a moment. It ended with acceptance. After that realization, nothing changed. And that was the problem. You still woke up early, still walked the same paths, still listened for the sky before you moved. But now, people relied on you. You were trusted with small things, important things, things no one explained. You carried messages you weren't meant to read. You memorized routes without asking why. You learned which steps were safe and which ones were only probably safe. You stopped thinking of yourself as young. Age stopped mattering. Usefulness did. Some days were loud, some days were quiet. The quiet ones felt worse because quiet made people believe the war had passed. You watched adults relax just enough to make mistakes. You watched children forget just enough to step forward. You wanted to warn them, but you didn't have the words. So you did what you had learned to do. You moved first. One day felt almost normal. The sky stayed quiet. No planes, no warnings. People stepped outside longer than they had in weeks. Children were sent on small errands again. The land looked calm. You were asked to go ahead. Just a few steps, just to check the path. It was a place you had seen your whole life, a field that once grew food, a shortcut everyone remembered. But the war never really leaves. It hides, beneath soil, beneath grass, beneath memory. You stepped where the ground looked the same as always. There was a dull crack, a sudden force. Then silence rushed back in. Not an explosion, not fire, just the ground doing what the war taught it to do. The sky stayed quiet. The village didn't understand right away. By the time they reached you, the field had already decided. That's how the war ended for you. Not in a battle, not holding a weapon, not as a soldier, but as a child, walking through what used to be home. When people talk about the Vietnam War, they talk about battles, politics, and history. They talk about dates, maps, numbers. They don't talk about the things the war left behind. Some people didn't experience the war as adults or soldiers. They experienced it as childhood. They survived the fighting, but not the silence after. And when you're born into war, you don't realize how dark it is until you learn the danger didn't end when the sky went quiet.